Hi, I'm Jim. Welcome to Urban Legends. This is part 3 of a 3-part series, so if you haven't watched part 1 and part 2, I highly recommend doing that now. There are a lot of details that I covered in the last 2 videos that might fill in a lot of gaps on what I'm going to cover here. And if there is one thing that I think played an outsized role in housing prices, and I touched on this in the last video, is the amount of capital that has been pumped into the market over the last 15 years or so, primarily because of low interest rates. But I'm a planner and not an economist. There are already a ton of great videos out there on the economics of this, so I'll leave that one to the experts. Okay, so let's cover a few terms that I will be using here. A unit is a countable noun describing any type of dwelling. For example, it's a 100-unit apartment building. It's a 150-unit subdivision. It's a mixed-use project with 400 units. Product, a type or types of housing specific to the project in question. For example, that 400-unit mixed-use project that we just talked about could have 3 different apartment products. It could have 4 different townhome products and 8 different detached products. A greenfield, previously undeveloped rural or agricultural land. Grayfield, think of a dead mall, or any kind of underutilized or decaying old commercial space. Brownfield, contaminated land, usually from industrial uses. Density. In urban planning circles, density almost always refers to the number of dwelling units per acre. Intensity. This typically refers to lot coverage or how much of a parcel of land the buildings take up. FAR. This is also another useful metric for measuring intensity. Floor area ratio is typically reserved for commercial buildings, and it describes the ratio of finished floor space to the total lot size. You may see a combination of density and FAR used for mixed-use buildings, and you may also see that in cities like NYC, particularly in Manhattan, where there are a lot of tall buildings, that they will apply FAR to all buildings regardless of use. So, exclusionary zoning, that's what we're here to talk about. I live in the Sun Belt in one of the fastest growing metro areas in the country. In the 1950s, Orlando had a regional population of about 115,000 people. That would put it somewhere between today's Sandusky, Ohio, and Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Metro area is generous, but 115,000 people put it at 138th largest metro area in 1950. Today, the honor of 138 goes to Canton, Ohio. And for context, 137 is Anchorage and 139 is Myrtle Beach. In other words, in 1950, Orlando was probably a place that you had heard of, but was not on your radar as a place you might go visit. Back in the 1920s, there were apartment buildings in and around downtown, but in the world before central air conditioning, no one chose to live on an upper floor. And besides, this place was so small and land was so cheap that nowhere was more than 3 or 4 miles from downtown. So if you weren't buying a house when you moved here, you most likely just rented one. State Route 436 is a mostly north-south road built in the late 1960s and is lined with apartments and townhomes for most of its 25-mile length. I've outlined all of the different apartment complexes around just one major intersection. So we did a great job with housing here, right? Not really. Huge areas of the county had been, and frankly still are, zoned for rural and agricultural uses and for low-density single-family housing. The county just limped from crisis to crisis. I would characterize the situation as less exclusionary as it was, this is the small town we live in, we're going to grow like a small town, lots of people rent houses, what's the problem? Oh, shit, I think we need some apartments. Here's a good spot. And none of that is to say that there aren't and weren't NIMBYs. It's just that there's a difference between underestimating future apartment demand and deliberately saying, if you can't afford this type of house, then you can't afford to live here. All right, keep that in mind because we're going to circle back to it. One of the big criticisms that you hear from the anti-gentrification crowd is that most new apartments are luxury apartments. And as a result, they charge steep rents. And they're not wrong. But as we went over in the last video, and should really go without saying, the fact that new apartments are more expensive than older apartments has always been the case, and it works that way the world over. The bigger problem here, and in most metro areas, isn't that there's a per se shortage of apartments. I mean, it's true, there is a shortage of apartments, and it is a problem. But it's not the only problem, and it's not even the biggest problem when it comes to total housing supply. In this graph, you can see the blue bars showing the number of people per household. So the number of one-person households, two-person households, three-person households, etc. The red bars are showing the number of units available with a concurrent number of bedrooms. So, for example, one-person household, one bedroom, two-person household, two bedroom, etc., etc. It's pretty clear that there are way too many 3 and 4 bedroom units and not enough 1 and 2 bedroom units. This graph is funny because it's showing Canadian stats, but they have a mostly similar housing profile to the US, and they have similar supply constraints. It's worse in Canada, but the reasons are similar, and so are the high costs that follow that. Here's a graph that I made that shows the situation in Orlando. Clearly, there are fewer units in Orange County compared to the entire country of Canada, but you can see that the ratio of supply and demand are completely out of whack. There are way too many 3, 4, 5 bedroom houses and not enough studio and 1 bedroom apartments. So here in the other OC, this OC, not that OC, this chart is our local problem writ large. It's also a problem in a lot of other fast-growing metros as well. I moved right at the beginning of COVID. We'd actually been looking for a few months before we found our house, but the decision got accelerated once we realized that we could be stuck in this tiny 2-bedroom apartment for months, if not years. At the time, there wasn't a glut of houses on the market, but there was a shortage of apartments, especially 2-bedroom apartments, and that makes them expensive. Again, in this OC, our household size and the supply for those household sizes is completely out of whack. 58% of our households are 1 person or 2 people, but only about 24% of the supply is useful to them. That not only forces smaller households to pay for more space than they need, it also forces them to compete with larger households for those larger spaces. Now, the housing shortage isn't a permanent problem, but it is a now problem. This was brought up in the comments in my last video, and it's something we need to discuss anyway, so let's just get it out of the way. This graph from Pew back in 2015 shows population declining sometime far off in the future. So today's housing problems will turn into a different problem in the future. It's going to become increasingly difficult for the US or any other developed country to continue to maintain its population through immigration. It's already the case that skilled migrants are getting harder and harder to come by. If you're watching this from Europe, this is already your reality in most countries. But in the US, it's not that far off in the future. If you're watching this and you're under the age of 40, this will happen in your lifetime. Okay, great, you say. The housing crisis won't be as much of a problem 30 years from now. But it's a problem now, so what do we do? And here's where we get to the root of the real problem. Zoning huge swaths of your metro area as large lot, detached, single family. It chews up a ton of real estate fast. These days, here in Orlando, the suburban fringe is 30 to 40 miles out from the center. That's far for a metro area of this size. That means that job density is probably low. It is. Which means that commutes are probably really long. They are. But it also means, somewhat surprisingly and maybe counterintuitively, that there are not a lot of opportunities for greenfield development. Now, you would expect a metro area that's sprawled out that far to be full of leapfrog development. And if you looked at an aerial map, you might be tempted to say, aha, but it is. Except what you're usually observing there are undevelopable wetlands, other preserved areas, and in some cases, some places that were set aside specifically for stormwater. When you do come across a greenfield site, it's typically something that looks like this. In other words, small and not for sale. But even if that lot were for sale, as you might imagine, it would fetch a pretty penny. And even if a developer were to buy it, they'd be paying top dollar for it. So they wouldn't be building apartments for the working man. They would most likely be building townhomes for the upper middle class. What we do have a fair amount of are brownfield sites, but what's even more common are grayfield sites. And there you get urban infill that looks like this.
All right, we're here at Fern Creek and East Colonial. And behind me
is the site of an old gas station and fast food restaurant. Well, it used to be, and now it's these apartments. But before it could be apartments, the site needed to be scraped and then remediated. In other words, they had to clear all the buildings that were there before, and then they had to do extensive environmental remediation before they could build anything new. Because remember, it was an old gas station, and those petroleum tanks usually leak. There's usually a significant amount of contamination. All that stuff has to be cleaned up before you can build residential. So, by the time you get to building apartments, you've already spent a ton of money. It looks how it looks. I'm not here to argue aesthetics. It's apartments and retail, and in my book, that's a win. Right? But in any case, keep in mind that all of the costs that go into the finished product, from buying and assembling the land to cleaning it up, or like basically what we would call site prep, getting the site ready to build, and then the actual building itself, all of those costs have to be recouped in the final sale. So urban infill projects like this, they always wind up being luxury apartments because that's the only way generally to recoup the costs, unless you're getting significant financial incentives from city, state, federal governments. We're just 2 blocks south of the apartment buildings. We're still on Fern Creek. We're just 2 blocks south of Colonial. And here is where there used to be 2 houses. Now there are 10 townhomes. So there are 5 fronting here on Fern Creek. And you can see just up in the distance is the Starbucks that we were just standing next to. And then the apartment building is diagonally across the street from that. And then you can see a bunch of the office infill that happened like late 60s, early 70s. Again, these are rear-loaded townhomes, so you can see the garages in the back, and there's 5 that front on Fern Creek, and then these 5 front on like a private, alleyway is not really a good term to describe it. I don't know what you would call it, because there's nothing on the other side of it. Well, there's a side of a house, but yeah, there you go. It's a nice private frontage though. I like it. But yeah, here's like a mid-century modern duplex, which is pretty cool. And then a little bit more mid-century next to it. But then right across the street, you can see what the neighborhood originally looked like. It's basically all bungalows. And I mean, like, these are all straight out of the Craftsman catalog. It's actually pretty crazy. And even different types of Craftsman too, like different styles from like slightly different years. Kit homes aren't unique to the US either. They were all over Canada and Australia, New Zealand as well, I think. But in any case, so like some of these bungalows are very obviously Craftsman, but you can see that Mission style is also Craftsman. And the house next to it, I don't remember the style, but I know I've seen it in the catalog before. But super cool. It's cool that there are so many of these houses still around, and even cooler that like basically amateurs put them together themselves, totally DIY 100 years ago, and they're still going strong, and people will pay good money to buy one because they're almost always in like the best part of every city. So how does exclusionary zoning contribute to the housing shortage? As I've tried to get across over these last few videos, the type of housing is really irrelevant. The problem was never really that we were building too many houses and not enough apartments. But wait, didn't I just say that there are too many 4-bedroom houses and not enough 1-bedroom apartments? Yes, I did. The product type is irrelevant. What matters is household size, and that there are enough units of that size that are affordable for the people who need them. We're getting closer to the solution, I promise. But the problem was never that we were building too many houses and not enough apartments. It's that we haven't been building enough of anything for at least the last 18 years. 50 years ago, no one predicted just how many people would move out of housing they shared with family or friends and would start looking for their own place to live in alone. Too much of the housing market is 3, 4, and 5 bedrooms and not enough 1 bedrooms and studios. And finally, that we built too much low density housing thinking that we'd never run out of land. So again, in the end, what really matters is not the product type. What matters is that it's affordable and that people who want a 1 or 2 bedroom can find it and afford it. If you don't have enough habitable housing for everyone, the housing that is there will rise in price relative to the size of the shortage and how much money is in the local economy. So here in Orange County, we have a mix that's almost 56% detached and almost 7% townhome. The rest, a little over 37%, are multi-unit buildings. That's not exactly the perfect mix, but it's not a bad mix either. But the problem is that 25% of our households are 1 person and 32.5% are 2 people. The number of apartments is a not very accurate proxy for meeting the demand of those households. Plenty of couples live in a townhouse or a detached house. There are a lot of 2-bedroom, 1-bath houses and townhomes, and even more 3-1 houses from the 1950s and 60s around here. My grandmother lived in a 3-1 townhouse by herself for almost 20 years after my grandfather died. And so that's somewhat normal for people in their later years. It's less normal for someone in their 20s and 30s who are now the core of your 1 and 2 bedroom apartment market. Having a high apartment ratio is irrelevant when 25% of your households are only 1 person, but then only 13% of your units are 1 bedroom or studio. And this problem is by no means unique to Orlando or even to the US. So how do we prevent this in the future, and how do we remediate the damage that's already been done? Well, first, it's recognizing that the problem has 3 dimensions. The first is that we haven't been building enough housing. The second is that what we did build was for the wrong market. And the third is that large lot zoning and parking requirements are a huge part of the supply constraints.
I'm here in Collingswood, just east of New Jersey. I'm here in Collingswood, just east of Philadelphia. Collingswood's a small borough with about 15,000 people in 1.5 square miles. It's got a development pattern that's pretty typical of small towns throughout the state that can yield anywhere from 10,000 to 12,000 people per square mile. As you can see here, there's a small part of the town that's mostly townhomes and twins.
As you can see, or maybe not, so I'll highlight it, only a small portion of the area, outlined in red pen here, is single-family attached in the form of townhomes and twins.
There are a few apartments above the shops on Haddon Avenue, and some are being renovated as we speak, but they still don't add up to more than a few dozen. There's 1 apartment building, but the rest of the town is detached single-family on relatively small lots.
Just 3 miles away, the pattern of development yields only about 2,500 people per square mile. But it's hard to claim that this zoning is exclusionary when around 40% of the units are apartments. It's the pattern of development, not the housing type, that is yielding low densities and a lack of housing. Again, these 2 images are to scale. It's the same land area, but there are almost 4 times as many people living in the neighborhood on the left versus the neighborhood on the right. The neighborhood on the right is around 60% detached single family and around 40% apartment. The neighborhood on the left is around 90% single family. That's broken down into 50% detached and 40% attached, and only 10% apartment. It's that car-centric pattern of development on the right that gets you appallingly low densities and FAR. It chews up too much land too fast, and in doing so, raises the cost of everything that comes later. But in almost every metro area in the country, that ship has sailed. It's too late because that's already the pattern of development of a big chunk of those metro areas, 20 to 30 miles out from the center. So what then? Because we've already established that urban infill is difficult, it's expensive, and it takes forever. What would yield a lot of new units, cheaply and quickly? Duplexes and triplexes. But let me be clear here, because even in my profession, people still get confused by this. A duplex is not a twin, and vice versa. This is a twin. It was built as 2 homes, and in fact, these are fee simple. Fee simple title is a fixture of land ownership in all common law countries. Fee simple means you own it outright, no encumbrances. You own the land and all of the buildings on it. So this is not a condominium or what you'd call strata title in Australia. The property line runs right down the middle of the stairs and the firewall, and each house comes with its own deed. They're basically townhomes, but it's like both houses are the end units. And note the symmetry. The two homes are mirror images. That's why they're called twins. So yes, in terms of housing supply, we also need more twins, but those would be new builds. You'd be building them new. If we're looking at adding low-cost housing, the cheapest and quickest way to do that is by adding it into the existing housing stock. And obviously, people also point to ADUs. And yeah, we also need ADUs, but they're very niche. They're almost always either one-bedroom or studios, which is great, but they're way more expensive to build than most people realize. So this is a duplex, not a twin, a duplex. This was built as one house, and there's only one deed for it. It was converted into 2 apartments. In this particular case, they enclosed the front porch, slapped an exterior door on it, and made it the entrance to the first floor apartment, while the back door is the entrance to the upstairs apartment. So right now in my own neighborhood, I can build an ADU in my backyard. I could also tear my house down and build 3 or 4 new townhomes in its place. But what I'm definitely not allowed to do is convert this house into 2 units. And in my opinion, that is a ridiculous and pointless distinction. New construction is costly, and it creates the same, if not more, of a burden on infrastructure. And the upside to converting existing housing into multiple units is that 40 or 50 years from now, when your demographics are completely different, you can convert them back to single family. Allowing duplex conversions in existing single family neighborhoods is way cheaper than tearing stuff down and starting over. And I don't want to make it sound like converting existing houses is completely without consequences. Obviously, if you're increasing density substantially, you may have to upgrade existing infrastructure. And that especially goes for sewer and water, but it may also go for your road infrastructure and especially transit infrastructure if that's your goal. But then, of course, that goes for any type of infill. If you're adding density to an existing area, there's an infrastructure cost burden to that needs to be addressed. When you build a bunch of new units and then a generation or 2 later, you have dramatically different demand, you wind up with a ton of product that's not even worth the cost to tear it down. And yeah, this is exactly what happened in Detroit. And also, this is not unique to the US. Places like Italy, Japan, and even Spain are somewhat famous for it now. So yeah, the peak of population in the US is coming at some point between 2043 and 2080. And that might seem like it's a long way off in the future, but for most of you watching this, it's in your lifetime. And it's better in the long run to have a flexible product type that you can Tetris as needed when demand warrants than it is to have a housing stock that's 50% vacant. So yes, we need more apartments, but the laser focus of some people on new construction apartments and dense urban infill not only misses the fundamentals on the economics of that infill, but is also incredibly short-sighted. What we need is more units that are affordable, and that can be achieved by any number of means. The more tools in the toolbox, the faster we get the job done. I'm Jim. This is Urban Legends. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. So, if you've been following along these last couple of videos, thanks. To recap, we have not been building enough housing, and there's an overwhelming shortage of it. There's a particularly acute shortage of housing for 1- and 2-person households, who also happen to be the fastest growing segment of the housing market. New construction is expensive, and because of the high cost of land and site prep, urban infill is some of the most expensive housing that we can build. 30 to 40 years from now, we're going to have radically different housing demand from what we have right now. The fastest way to deal with that problem is to start chopping up these larger homes into 3- and 4-unit apartment buildings. This is exactly what we did during World War II when we had very similar supply constraints. While I'm a strong believer in subsidies for affordable housing, what we don't need is inclusionary housing programs that throw hundreds of millions of dollars at the biggest developers with the deepest pockets, all for maybe 1,000 or 2,000 units of apartments that aren't even affordable to those earning under 80% of the median. What we do need is inclusionary zoning that immediately lifts restrictions on duplex, triplex, and quad conversions and brings way more product to the market way faster and for way cheaper. And as opposed to making mega developers even more powerful, it'll give a leg up to the smaller developers that we so desperately need more of. When you're a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, and when you're a mega developer, every problem looks like an opportunity for rent seeking. All right, thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.